Good evening, folks, and welcome back to BeardTime Stories and our continued fun read-through of Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. Now, in the first few chapters, we have had the arrival of Mr. Bingley, the £4,000-a-month gentleman, and then we also were introduced to his friend, quote, Mrs. Bennet at the end of Chapter 3, not handsome enough to dance with, Mr. Darcy. Oh, I could feel Mr. Darcy's pain there, the not handsome enough to dance with. Far too many absolutely wretched high school dances. Oh, but anyway, we are now on Chapter 4. So sit back, grab your tea, coffee, or whatever it is you're drinking this evening, relax, and let's jump into our BeardTime story of the evening with Chapter 4 of Pride and Prejudice. Chapter 4. When Jane and Elizabeth were alone, the former, who had been cautious in her praise of Mr. Bingley before, expressed to her sister how very much she admired him. "He is just what a young man ought to be," said she, "sensible, good-humored, lively, and I never saw such happy manners, so much ease, with such perfect good breeding." "He is also handsome," replied Elizabeth, "which a young man ought likewise to be, if he possibly can. His character is thereby complete. Ah, yes, money, good manners, and handsome. That's all we need, gents. I was very much flattered by his asking me to dance a second time. I did not expect such a compliment." "Did you not?" "I did for you. But that is one of the great differences between us. Compliments always take you by surprise, and me never. What could be more natural than his asking you again? He could not help seeing that you were about 5 times as pretty as every other woman in the room. No thanks to his gallantry for that. Well, he certainly is very agreeable, and I give you leave to like him. You have liked many a stupider person." "Dear Lizzie." "Oh, and you are a great deal too apt, you know, to like people in general. You never see a fault in anybody. All the world are good and agreeable in your eyes. I never heard you speak ill of a human being in your life." I forgot how much of a spirit animal Elizabeth can be for me sometimes. We all have that one friend who is very much Jane, the eternal optimist. And then you have people like Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth, who I am very much more inclined towards. Where were we? "Oh, you are a great deal too apt, you know, to like people in general. You never see a fault in anybody. All the world are good and agreeable in your eyes. I have never heard you speak ill of a human being in my life. I would wish not to be hasty in censuring anyone, but I always speak what I think. I know you do, and that which makes the wonder, with your good sense, to be so honestly blind to the follies and nonsense of others. Affection of candor is common enough. One meets it in everyone. But to be candid without ostentation or design, to take the good of everybody's character and make it still better, and say nothing of the bad, belongs to you alone. And so you like this man's sisters, do you? Their manners are not equal to his." "Certainly not, at first, but they are very pleasing women when you converse with them. Miss Bingley is to live with her brother and keep his house, and I am much mistaken if we shall not find a very charming neighbor in her." Elizabeth listened in silence, but was not convinced. Their behavior at the assembly had not been calculated to please in general. And with more quickness of observation and less pliancy of temper than her sister, and with a judgment too unassailed by attention to herself, she was very little disposed to approve them. They were, in fact, very fine ladies, not deficient in good humor when they were pleased, nor in power of being agreeable when they chose it, but proud and conceited. They were rather handsome, had been educated in one of the first private cemeteries in town. Cemeteries, yes, educated in the private seminary in town. Good God. Had a fortune of £20,000, and were in the habit of spending more than they ought, and of associating with people of rank, and were therefore in every respect entitled to think well of themselves, and meanly of others. They were of a respectable family in the north of England, a circumstance more deeply impressed on their memories than that of their brother's fortune, and their own had been acquired by trade. Mr. Bingley inherited property to the amount of nearly £100,000 from his father, who he had intended to purchase an estate, but did not live to do it. Mr. Bingley intended it likewise, and sometimes made choice of his county. But as he was now provided with a good house and the liberty of a manor, It was doubtful to many of those who best knew the easiness of his temper whether he might not spend the remainder of his days at Netherfield and leave the next generation to purchase. His sisters were very anxious for his having an estate of his own, but though he was now established only as a tenant, Miss Bingley was by no means unwilling to preside at his table. Nor was Mrs. Hurst, who had married a man of more fashion than fortune, less disposed to consider his house as her home when it suited her. Mr. Bingley had not been of age 2 years when he was tempted by an accidental recommendation to look at Netherfield House. He did look into it, and into it for half an hour, and was pleased with the situation, and the principal rooms, satisfied with what the owner had said in its praise, and took it immediately. Well, he didn't check the roof or get it appraised. It's going to fail in 5 years. Between him and Darcy there was a very steady friendship, in spite of a great opposition of his character. Bingley was endeared to Darcy by the easiness, openness, and ductibility of his own temper, though no disposition could offer a greater contrast to his own, and though with his own he never appeared dissatisfied. On the strength of Darcy's regard, Bingley had the firmest reliance, and of his judgment the highest opinion. In understanding Darcy was the superior. Bingley was by no means deficient, but Darcy was clever. He was at the same time haughty, reserved, fastidious, and his manners, though well-bred, were not inviting. In that respect, his friend had greatly the advantage. Bingley was sure of being liked wherever he appeared, and Darcy was continually giving offense. The manner in which they spoke of the Meryton Assembly was sufficiently characteristic. Bingley had never met with pleasanter people or prettier girls in his life. Everyone had been most kind and attentive to him. There had been no formality, no stiffness. He had soon felt acquainted with all the room, and as to Miss Bennet, he could not conceive an angel more beautiful. Darcy, on the contrary, had seen a collection of people in whom there was very little beauty and no fashion, for none of whom he had felt even the smallest interest, and from none received either attention or pleasure. Miss Bennet he acknowledged to be pretty, but she smiled too much. Mrs. Hurst and her sister allowed it to be so, but they still admired her and liked her, and pronounced her to be a sweet girl, and one whom they should not object to know more of. Miss Bennet was therefore established as a sweet girl, and their brother felt authorized by such a commendation to think of her as he chose. Oh, freaking hell of Darcy. And Bingley. Dear sweet Bingley. I believe we'll continue on with Chapter 5 tonight, as that was a little bit shorter. So Chapter 5. Within a walk of Longbourn lived a family with whom the Bennets were particularly intimate. Sir William Lucas had been formerly in trade with Meryton, where he had made a tolerable fortune and risen to the honor of a knighthood by an address to the king during his mayoralty. The distinction had perhaps felt too strongly. It had given him a disgust to his business and to his residence in a small market town, and, quitting them both, he had removed his family to a house about a mile from Meryton, denominated from that period Lucas Lodge, where he could think with pleasure of his own importance, and, unshackled by business, occupy himself solely in being civil to all the world. For though elated by his rank, it did not render him supercilious. There's a new word for me, and that is a very rare thing, folks. Supercilious. On the contrary, he was all attention to everybody. By nature inoffensive, friendly, and obliging, his presentation at St. James had made him courteous. Lady Lucas was a very good kind of woman, not too clever to be a valuable neighbor to Mrs. Bennet, and they had several children. The eldest of them, a sensible, intelligent young woman, about 27, was Elizabeth's intimate friend. That the Miss Lucases and Miss Bennets should meet to talk over a ball was absolutely necessary, and the morning after the assembly brought the former to Longbourn to hear and to communicate. "You began the evening well, Charlotte," said Mrs. Bennet with a civil self-command to Miss Lucas. "You were Mr. Bingley's first choice." "Yes, but he seemed like his second better." "Oh, you mean Jane, I suppose, because he danced with her twice." "To be sure, that did seem as if he admired her. Indeed, I rather believe he did. I heard something about it, but I hardly know what. Something about Mr. Robinson." "Perhaps you mean what I overheard between him and Mr. Robinson? Did I not mention it to you?" Mr. Robinson asking him how he liked our Meryton assemblies, and whether he did not think there were a great many pretty women in the room, and which he thought was the prettiest, and his answering immediately to the last question, "Oh, the eldest Miss Bennet, beyond a doubt. There cannot be two opinions on that point." "Upon my word. Well, that was very decided indeed." That does seem as if, but, however, it all may come to nothing, you know. My overhearings are more to the purpose than yours, Eliza, said Charlotte. Mr. Darcy is not so well worth listening to as his friend, is he? Poor Eliza, to be only just tolerable. That is brutal. I beg you would not put it into Lizzie's head to be vexed by his ill treatment, for he is such a disagreeable man that it would be quite a misfortune to be liked by him. Sorry. Mrs. Long told me last night that he had sat close to her for half an hour without once opening his lips. Are you quite sure, ma'am? Is not there a little mistake, said Jane. I certainly saw Mr. Darcy speaking to her. Aye, because she asked him how he last liked Netherfield, and he could not help answering her, but she said he seemed very angry at being spoke to. Miss Bingley told me, said Jane, that he never speaks much unless among his intimate acquaintances. With them he is remarkably agreeable. Oh my gosh, keeping a small circle of friends. Although at the same time, I personally tend to be a bit more of a social butterfly, because I enjoy meeting new people, so yeah. I do love Darcy, though. I do not believe a word of it, my dear. If he had been so very agreeable, he would have talked to Mrs. Long. But I can guess how it was, and everyone says that he is ate up with pride, and I dare say he heard somehow that Mrs. Long does not keep a carriage, and that had come to the ball in a hack chaise. I do not mind that he is not talking to Mrs. Long, said Miss Lucas, but I wish he had danced with Eliza. Another time, Lizzie, said her mother. I would not dance with him if I were you. I believe, ma'am, I may safely promise you never to dance with him. His pride, said Miss Lucas, does not offend me so much as pride often does, because there is an excuse for it. One cannot wonder that so very fine a young man, with family, fortune, and everything in his favor, should think highly of himself. If I may so express it, he has a right to be proud. That is very true, replied Elizabeth, and I could easily forgive his pride if he had not mortified mine. Pride, observed Mary, who had piqued herself upon the solidity of her reflections, is a very common failing, I believe. By all that I have read, I am convinced that it is very common indeed, and that human nature is particularly prone to it, and that there are very few of us who do not cherish a feeling of self-complacency on the score of some quality or other, real or imaginary. Vanity and pride are different things, though the words are often used synonymously. A person may be proud without being vain. Pride relates more to our own opinion of ourselves, vanity to what we would have others think of us. If I were as rich as Mr. Darcy, cried a young Lucas, who had come with his sisters, I should not care how proud I was. I would keep a pack of foxhounds and drink a bottle of wine every day. Then you would drink a great deal more than you ought, said Mrs. Bennet, and if I were you, I would see to it to take care of your bottle directly. Oh, I'm sorry. And if I were to see you at it, I should take away your bottle directly. The boy protested that she should not, and she continued to declare that she would, and the argument was ended only with the visit. And I believe we'll call it there for the evening, folks. Have a lovely night. Sleep well. Remember, never give up. Never surrender. Sleep well. Have a good night.